The U.S. military's top brass summoned to Quantico, Virginia, 800 top officers. Secretary Hegseth outlining his vision, what's now expected of those military leaders, and talking about the highest male standard only for all of those who serve in the U.S. military. Then President Trump on stage, the president saying he has told Secretary Hegseth we should use some dangerous cities as training grounds for our military. Here's Martha Raddatz.
In an unprecedented meeting, which the former Weekend Fox and Friends host broadcast live, Secretary Pete Hegseth warning hundreds of combat-tested generals, admirals, and senior officers flown in from around the world that the military under his leadership will be dramatically changed.
No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses. No more climate change worship. No more division, distraction, or gender delusions. No more debris. We are done with that.
Hey people, Adam here. Let me tell you what just happened. The constitutional relationship between civilian authority and military leadership is under unprecedented strain, forcing a historic choice between principles. This is a turning point that constitutional scholars and historians will analyze for generations. The tension we are talking about here is between the constitutional principle of civilian control of the military, which requires the professional military to defer to elected civilian authority, and the professional and legal obligation of military officers to refuse clearly illegal orders, which requires them to act against that deference when the civilian authority issues commands that violate the laws of war. Those moments have always been rare. The American military has an extraordinary tradition of political neutrality and institutional deference to civilian authority that is held through wars, through contested elections, through every kind of political controversy the country has produced. And that tradition is now under a strain that no previous generation of American military officers has faced in quite the same form.
Does the Pentagon have the right to punish Kelly over the video?
Again, caveat, I'm not a lawyer, but I have talked to several military lawyers on this. Very unlikely. First of all, Kelly and the other politicians in the video were stating the obvious. They were stating that military service members have not only the right, but the obligation to resist illegal orders. They didn't specify or accuse the Trump administration of having given illegal orders, but they said they're reminding service members that they have the obligation to refuse those orders. The second thing that would complicate, I think, any sort of prosecution of Kelly is that Trump and Hegseth, the president and secretary of defense, have already made public statements that constitute what we call unlawful command influence. In other words, you have the secretary of defense and the president who are in the military chain of command saying on social media that Trump said this constitutes sedition, which is punishable by death.
Because the specific tension building right now is not between the military and a civilian government whose policies officers disagree with. It is between the military's constitutional obligation to refuse illegal orders and a commander-in-chief who has said publicly that he wants generals who are totally loyal, who has compared the relationship he wants with his military commanders to the relationship Hitler had with his generals, and who has responded to any expression of professional military judgment that differs from his preferences by firing, purging, or excluding the officer who expressed it. The military chiefs who have declared Trump unfit for command are not doing so as a partisan political act or as an intervention in electoral politics. They are doing so as a constitutional warrant grounded in the specific oath they took to the Constitution and the specific professional standards for command fitness that they spent their careers applying to others and that they are now applying to the person who holds the title of Commander-in-Chief. And his response, the storming out, the firings, the purges, the staff meeting from which he was excluded because his own aides concluded his temperament would derail the planning.
While the generals and admirals sat largely silent through the speech, Hegseth said military fitness and standards will be enforced. No more fat generals or admirals, he said.
I don't want my son serving alongside troops who are out of shape, or in combat unit with females who can't meet the same combat arms physical standards as men.
For those ground combat roles, which women have been performing for more than a decade, the high male standard will now be the norm.
If that means no women qualify for some combat jobs, so be it.
and Hegseth defending the firing of more than a dozen senior officers, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, and the head of the Navy, Lisa Franchetti.
For too long, we've promoted too many uniformed leaders for the wrong reasons, based on their race, based on gender quotas, based on historic so-called firsts.
Is a story that tells you everything you need to know about the state of civilian-military relations under this presidency. What makes the military chief's declaration of unfitness categorically different from the other forms of institutional pushback we have been seeing is the specific weight that military voices carry in American public life. The judicial pushback, the congressional removal demands, the legal and financial exposure, none of these carry the same weight or reach the same constituencies as the military dimension of Trump's confrontation with American institutions. The military is the institution that Americans trust more than any other, more than Congress, more than the courts, more than any political party or media outlet or executive agency. Poll after poll across decades shows that the American public places higher confidence in the military than in any other institutional actor in American public life. And the specific weight of that trust is what makes it so consequential. When senior military officers, retired 4-stars, former Joint Chiefs, defense officials who have spent decades inside the system, go on the record saying the person claiming the title of Commander-in-Chief is unfit to hold it, this is not partisan commentary. This is not op-ed writers and cable news analysts reaching for dramatic language.
Yeah, Willie, I did talk to a few, many people in that room I've served with. I didn't retire that long ago, so some of those senior members were junior members when I was still in the service. What was interesting is it came about in two parts. First of all, Secretary Hegseth's address. I took notes as he spoke, as I was watching it. And just some of the things that I made bullet points about were Liberation Day, kill things and break people, or kill people and break things, war crimes, Geneva Convention elimination, rules of engagements are unnecessary, suggesting women can't meet the standards, returning to the days of drill sergeants smoking recruits during basic training, suggesting the elimination of IG actions, especially as he's being investigated for the use of signal apps by those IGs.
This is the people who have actually held military command, who have actually exercised military power, who understand exactly what the standards for fitness to command require, and who have concluded after observing Trump up close that he does not meet those standards in ways that are specific, documented, and dangerous. The picture those facts paint, retired commanders calling him unfit, active duty chiefs being purged for insufficient loyalty, aides excluding him from crisis planning because his temperament was a liability, is not a collection of partisan criticisms. It is a documented pattern of institutional judgment about fitness to command that is converging across multiple sources and multiple categories of evidence. Let's build the complete picture starting with the most important conceptual piece, the specific constitutional, legal, and professional framework within which the military chief's fitness declarations carry the weight they carry, and without which the declarations could be dismissed as political opinion rather than professional military assessment. In the American military system, the obligation to refuse illegal orders is not a political position. It is a legal requirement embedded in the Uniform Code of Military Justice and in the broader framework of international laws of war that the United States military has formally committed to uphold. Every officer who is commissioned in the American military takes an oath not to the president, but to the Constitution. That distinction is not ceremonial. It is operational. It means that when a president orders something that violates the laws of war, something that constitutes a war crime under international humanitarian law, military officers are not just permitted to refuse, they are required to refuse. The Nuremberg principle established after World War II that following orders does not excuse war crimes is embedded in American military law and in the professional culture of the officer corps. The specific things Trump has said he would do, ordering torture of detainees, targeting civilians of adversary nations as collective punishment, deploying the military domestically against American citizens he describes as enemies from within, are not ambiguous legal questions where reasonable legal minds differ about whether the orders are appropriate. They are the specific categories of conduct that military officers are trained through their professional education and through the explicit requirements of the UCMJ and the laws of war to recognize as clearly illegal orders that must be refused, regardless of who issues them and regardless of the personal or professional consequences of that refusal. This is not a political argument about Trump's policies. It is a legal description of how the American military's command framework actually operates. This is the context within which the early warnings as far back as 2016, commentators saying that uniformed leaders at every level will refuse to obey a commander-in-chief like Trump, were not partisan hyperbole. They were accurate descriptions of how the American military's legal framework actually works. Now, let's talk about the firing of General C.Q. Brown specifically and in detail, because this is the single action that most clearly and most directly demonstrates the specific strategy Trump is pursuing in his relationship with military leadership. Multiple defense analysts and constitutional experts have described that strategy as straight out of the autocrat playbook in terms that are more precise than they might initially appear. General C.Q. Brown was not fired because of any performance failure or any professional misconduct. He was fired, according to reporting, as part of a broader effort to remove military leaders who had supported diversity and equity initiatives and who were viewed by Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth as insufficiently loyal. Think carefully about what the stated reasoning reveals about the standard being applied. Brown was the first black officer to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a historic appointment that represented decades of distinguished military service, culminating in the most senior uniformed position in the American military. He was fired not because he failed at his military duties, but because he was insufficiently politically loyal. Because he represented an institutional culture built on professional meritocracy, institutional independence from political direction, and the principle that military leadership serves the Constitution, rather than the individual who temporarily holds the office that Trump and Hegseth wanted to replace with something fundamentally different. A military command structure in which the primary criterion for advancement and retention is not professional excellence or institutional judgment, but personal loyalty to the commander-in-chief as an individual. The analysis describes this as exactly the playbook of authoritarian leaders who understand that the military is the key institutional actor that can either enable or prevent the consolidation of personal power and who systematically replace professional military leadership with politically reliable subordinates as one of the first steps in that consolidation. What makes the C.Q. Brown firing so alarming in that context is not just that one officer was removed, it is what the removal was for. Because a military purge based on loyalty rather than performance creates a command structure where the officers who remain are selected specifically for their willingness not to say no to the commander-in-chief. And a military command structure that cannot say no is one of the most dangerous configurations in democratic governance. And then there is the Iran rescue meeting revelation, which is the single most striking, most constitutionally significant, and most operationally concrete event in this entire story, and which deserves careful and specific attention because of what it reveals not just about Trump's fitness, but about how the people who know him best and work with him most closely have privately assessed that fitness. When the Wall Street Journal reports that Trump's own aides made a deliberate decision to exclude the commander-in-chief from a critical military planning session, they are not reporting a bureaucratic oversight or scheduling conflict. They are reporting a deliberate judgment by the people closest to him that his involvement would harm the operation. That judgment made by people whose professional lives depend on staying in his good graces is the most operationally direct expression of the fitness assessment that retired generals have been making publicly for years. Reporting based on multiple sources describes Trump's own aides, the people who work for him, whose careers depend on his goodwill, who have every incentive to include him in major decisions, making the deliberate choice to exclude him from a critical strategic planning session for an Iran rescue operation. The specific reason cited was that his impatience would not be helpful. They kept him out. They updated him later by phone, and then they continued the planning without him. Stop and think about what that means in terms of the constitutional framework within which it occurred, and about the specific inversion of principle it represents. Civilian control of the military is one of the foundational principles of American democracy, embedded in the Constitution, enforced through congressional oversight, and operationalized through the chain of command that runs from the elected civilian president through the defense secretary and the joint chiefs to every operational commander. It means the president makes the ultimate decisions about the use of military force. It means military officers provide honest professional advice, and civilian leadership makes the final calls with the benefit of that advice. That system exists specifically to prevent the military from becoming an autonomous actor that makes decisions about war and peace without civilian oversight. When Trump's own aides exclude him from a military planning session because they assess that his involvement would harm the mission, they have inverted the entire framework that civilian control is designed to protect. They are not advising civilian authority. They are shielding the operation from it. Because they have concluded that in this specific person's case, civilian authority is a liability rather than an asset to the mission being planned. That inversion, that soft internal de facto judgment that the commander-in-chief should not be in the room for serious military decisions, is the most direct operational expression of the fitness assessment that retired generals have been making publicly for years. It is the people closest to him saying through their actions rather than their words the same thing the 4 stars have been saying in the press. Here is what connects all of the individual elements. The fitness declarations from retired 4 stars, the firing of CQ Brown for insufficient loyalty, the broader military purge, and the Iran meeting exclusion, that is the operational confirmation of the assessment the generals have been making in print into a single coherent and genuinely alarming picture about the state of civil-military relations under this administration. The elements are not coincidental. They form a pattern with a logic that becomes clear when you understand what total loyalty means in the context of military command. The pattern has a logic. Trump wants total loyalty because his conception of command is personal rather than institutional. He does not want professional military judgment that might constrain his options. He wants execution of his directives without the professional pushback that comes from officers who have been trained to identify illegal orders and refuse them, who have institutional loyalties to the Constitution and the laws of war that predate and supersede their loyalty to any individual president. In the response of the professional military to that demand, the public fitness declarations, the implicit resistance expressed through the Iran meeting exclusion, the tradition of officers who have held real command positions going on record about the danger, is the institutional self-defense of an organization that understands what total loyalty to an individual rather than the Constitution produces when it is taken to its conclusion. That understanding comes from history. It comes from the training that every officer receives in the laws of war and the Nuremberg principles. And it comes from the professional culture of an institution that has built its identity around the idea that military power serves the Constitution rather than any individual who temporarily holds constitutional office. The military chief's declarations of Trump's unfitness are not partisan political statements. They are professional assessments grounded in specific legal and constitutional frameworks that every military officer is trained to apply. And their convergence across multiple sources, multiple time periods, creates the most credible and most consequential institutional verdict on fitness to command that exists in American public life. Here is what you need to understand about why the military fitness declarations carry a categorically different and higher order of credibility than any other category of institutional criticism Trump faces, and why the specific audience these declarations reach is the one that matters most politically for understanding the long-term consequences of the fitness consensus that is building in the military community. Political opponents calling Trump unfit can be dismissed as partisan. Legal analysts calling his conduct criminal can be dismissed as overreach. Even judges ruling against him can be framed as a rigged system. But retired 4-star officers, people who have no partisan political career to advance, who have spent their lives in an institution defined by its apolitical character, and who understand the specific legal and operational meaning of fitness to command from the inside. When those people go on the record saying a person is unfit to be commander-in-chief, there is no available partisan frame that neutralizes the credibility of that assessment for the specific audience it reaches most powerfully. Veterans, military families, the people who trust the uniform above every other institution. And those are exactly the voters whose assessments of Trump's fitness are shaped more by what decorated commanders say than by anything a politician or a legal analyst can say. The fitness declarations are not just morally and professionally significant. They are politically significant in a way that reaches constituencies that partisan attacks cannot reach. And the fact that those declarations have been coming from multiple sources across years and are now accompanied by the concrete action of a staff meeting exclusion that confirms the assessment operationally makes this moment different from earlier rounds of military concern about Trump. The military purge being conducted by Trump and Hegseth is the most operationally dangerous aspect of the entire civil-military confrontation because it is attempting to solve the fitness problem from the wrong direction. replacing professional military judgment with political loyalty, in a way that degrades the actual quality of military decision-making while producing the appearance of unified command support. Let us be specific about why replacing officers based on political loyalty rather than professional performance is so dangerous from a purely military effectiveness standpoint, independent of the constitutional concerns and independent of any partisan political analysis. Because the danger is operational rather than ideological, and will manifest in mission outcomes rather than in political debate. Military command at the highest levels requires officers who will give the commander honest assessments of what is and is not militarily achievable, who will identify when proposed courses of action are illegal or counterproductive, and who will refuse to execute orders that would expose American service members to unnecessary risk or that would violate the laws of war. Those functions, honest assessment, identification of illegal orders, refusal to comply with them, are not signs of disloyalty. They are the core professional responsibilities of senior military officers. An officer corps that has been selected for political loyalty rather than professional judgment is an officer corps that will tell the commander what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. It is an officer corps that will fail to identify illegal orders as illegal because identifying them would be career-ending. And it is an officer corps that will execute orders it would normally refuse, because the officers who understood why those orders should be refused and who had the institutional standing and career security to say so have already been removed, and replaced with people whose selection criterion was willingness to comply rather than professional judgment about when compliance is appropriate. That is not a stronger military. It is a more compliant but operationally more dangerous one. The danger is not to adversaries, but to the specific protections that the laws of war and the constitutional framework exist to provide. And the 4 stars who are publicly warning about Trump's fitness for command are warning specifically about this downstream consequence, about what happens when the purge is complete, about what happens when the people who would have said no are gone, and the people who remain are the ones who were selected precisely because they would not. The civil-military relationship in a democracy is one of those institutional arrangements that works invisibly when it is functioning correctly. When professional military officers provide honest advice, civilian leaders make final decisions, and both parties operate within the constitutional framework that defines their respective roles and limits, you do not notice it working. You notice when it breaks, and the signals that it is breaking are everywhere in the current situation. Officers being fired for insufficient loyalty rather than professional failure. Staff excluding the commander-in-chief from operational planning because his participation would harm the mission. Retired 4 stars using terms like clearly, demonstrably, irredeemably unfit in publications that reach the professional defense community. These are not normal features of civil-military relations in a healthy democracy. They are warning signs that the institutional framework is under stress in ways that have serious implications for both democratic governance and actual military effectiveness. Watch for any additional senior military firings or forced retirements, because each one adds to the documented pattern of command purge and tells you something about whether the process of replacing professional judgment with political loyalty is accelerating or plateauing. Watch for any public statements from currently serving military officers that express concern about orders or directives, because statements of that kind, given the extreme rarity and career risk they represent, signal that the pressure on the serving military to choose between professional obligation and political loyalty has reached a level that some officers cannot absorb in silence. And watch for any reporting on how the restructured military command responds to the next major crisis, because the quality of military decision-making under pressure is the ultimate test of whether the purge has degraded the institutions. Effectiveness in the way that the fitness declarations predicted it would. The generals have spoken, the pattern is documented, and the consequences of building a military command structure designed for total loyalty rather than professional judgment will eventually be visible in the outcomes that matter most. Let's talk about the specific historical precedents that make this moment so alarming. The comparison Trump himself made to Hitler's generals was not a casual remark. It was a revealing statement about how he conceives of the relationship between civilian leadership and military command. Hitler systematically purged the German military officer corps of anyone who expressed independent judgment or resisted his directives, replacing them with officers who demonstrated personal loyalty to him above all else. The consequences of that purge were catastrophic, not just for Germany, but for the world. Because a military command structure that cannot say no to a dangerous civilian leader is a military command structure that will execute dangerous orders without the professional pushback that might have prevented the worst outcomes. The American military has built its entire professional culture around preventing exactly that outcome. The training and the laws of war, the emphasis on the oath to the Constitution rather than to any individual, the institutional independence that allows officers to give honest advice without fear of retaliation. All of these are designed to ensure that American military power serves constitutional purposes rather than the whims of any individual leader. The current purge is systematically dismantling those protections, replacing institutional independence with personal loyalty, and creating a command structure that increasingly resembles the one that Trump himself has praised. This is not alarmist rhetoric. This is a factual description of what is happening, documented by multiple sources and confirmed by the actions of the administration itself. The retired four-star officers who have spoken out are not motivated by partisan politics. They are motivated by the same professional standards that governed their entire careers and by the same constitutional oath that they took when they were commissioned. They understand that the military exists to defend the Constitution, not to serve any individual who holds the title of commander-in-chief. And they understand that when a president demonstrates a pattern of rejecting constitutional constraints, praising authoritarian models of command, and purging officers who express independent professional judgment, they have an obligation to speak out about the danger that pattern represents. The specific actions they have taken, the public statements, the op-eds, the interviews, are the professional equivalent of a warning siren. They are trying to alert the American public and the broader defense community to the fact that the military's institutional defenses are being systematically dismantled, and they are trying to do so before it is too late, before the purge is complete, before the officers who would say no are all gone, and before the command structure becomes a tool for the consolidation of personal power rather than a protector of constitutional democracy. The stakes could not be higher. The military is the most powerful institution in American life. It possesses the means of violence, the capacity to destroy, the ability to project power around the world. If that institution becomes the personal instrument of an authoritarian leader rather than the constitutional defender of democratic governance, everything changes. The military's commitment to the Constitution over any individual leader is being tested like never before, and the outcome will shape American democracy for generations. The next chapter will be written not in hearings, but in operational decisions when the crisis arrives.